Peace and grace to you, beloved child of God. There are moments in life when you can feel God moving long before anything shifts in the natural. Moments when you sense something stirring inside your spirit. Moments when your heart grows quiet, but not empty. Moments when your soul whispers, something is coming. Something is aligning. Something is returning. If you are watching this right now, I need you to hear me clearly. This is not a coincidence. This is not random. This is not an accident. This is timing. This is alignment. This is divine orchestration. There are reunions that humans build, and there are reunions heaven writes. What you are stepping into is not man-made. This is not a recycled relationship. This is not nostalgia. This is not emotional weakness. This is restoration. This is redemption. This is the chapter God withheld until you were strong enough to receive it. Your heart has been through storms. You've survived betrayals, disappointments, delays, and the kind of silence that makes you question your worth. You've prayed prayers that felt unanswered. You've cried tears God never ignored. You've walked through lonely seasons where you thought the story had ended. But hear me. There are stories God pauses, not because they are over, but because He is rewriting them. Someone is being sent back into your life. Not as who they were, but as who they've become. A reunion heaven authored hits differently. It doesn't drag your past forward. It brings your future into focus. It doesn't reopen wounds. It reveals healing. It doesn't trigger fear. It awakens clarity. It doesn't recreate cycles. It breaks them. And the reunion God is preparing you for is one that will make sense of every night you cried, every season you waited, every separation you survived. I want you to stay with me through this message, because what I'm about to reveal will bring confirmation you didn't even know you were waiting for. It will answer questions your heart has been carrying quietly. It will bring light to spiritual movements happening around you right now. And it will help you understand why this reunion is not just emotional, just prophetic. Before we go deeper, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. The one listening, the one waiting, the one hoping, the one healing. Your presence here matters. Your story matters. Your heart matters. Your love is seen, valued, and remembered by God. And if you are someone who returns to this channel because you find clarity, strength, comfort, healing, or revelation, I want you to subscribe to Daily Motivation Prayers right now. Not for numbers. Not for vanity. Not for growth. But because the messages I release here are crafted to meet you exactly where you are. In your heart, in your spirit, in your healing, in your journey toward the love God has written for you. And I promise you this. By the end of this video you will feel more aligned, more encouraged, more grounded, and more hopeful than you feel right now. You will understand why this reunion is not coming to distract you, but to bless you. Why it's not coming to repeat old pain, but to reveal new purpose. Why it's not coming to confuse you, but to confirm you. So take a deep breath. Open your heart, and lean into this moment. Because the reunion that's approaching you, the one heaven orchestrated, the one God whispered about in your spirit, the one your soul has been sensing, is not just emotional, it is divine. And now, let's go deeper. Number 1. The separation was never a rejection, it was God's way of preparing both of you for a reunion that would actually last. There are some separations that feel like devastation, but are actually divine intervention. And if you truly look back at your story, at the timing, the tension, the confusion, the unanswered questions, you'll start to see something you couldn't see before. The separation wasn't punishment. It wasn't abandonment. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't failure. It was protection. Not because you weren't meant to be together, but because you weren't ready to be together in the form God intended. I want you to hear this with your whole heart. The version of you back then, and the version of them back then, could not have carried the weight of the connection you both were destined for. Your heart loved deeply, but it wasn't healed deeply. Their heart cared for you, but it wasn't strengthened yet. You were open, but you weren't grounded. They were drawn to you, but they weren't stable. You were emotionally available, but not emotionally anchored. They were spiritually connected, but not spiritually mature. And God knew that if He allowed the connection to continue in that state, it would collapse under the pressure of unresolved wounds. Sometimes God doesn't separate people because they're wrong for each other. He separates them because they are too important to each other to ruin the connection prematurely. You were not rejected. You were redirected. You were pulled back for alignment. You were pulled back for clarity. You were pulled back for growth. You were pulled back so the version of love you receive is worthy of the version of love you give. What you felt as loss, heaven saw as protection. Because let's be honest, back then you were giving from a place of hope, not identity. You were loving from a place of emotion, not wholeness. You were offering loyalty but losing yourself in the process. You were showing up fully, even when they were only showing up halfway. You were pouring out, even when your own cup was empty. And them? They were drawn to your heart because it was pure. But they didn't yet understand how to honor something that rare. They felt a connection they couldn't explain. But they didn't have the maturity or emotional capacity to hold it. They cared but couldn't communicate. They felt but couldn't face what they felt. They wanted, but fear was louder than desire. So God allowed distance. God allowed silence. God allowed the disconnect that hurt you so deeply. Not because He wanted you broken, but because He wanted you prepared. You needed to learn not to shrink yourself for love. You needed to learn to choose yourself without guilt. You needed to develop emotional boundaries. You needed to heal old wounds that were shaping your reactions. You needed to regain your voice, your strength, your confidence, your clarity. And they needed to confront themselves. They needed to break patterns they inherited. They needed to outgrow their avoidance. They needed to face their fears of intimacy. They needed to become accountable. They needed to wake up spiritually. They needed to step into emotional adulthood instead of emotional impulse. You were not being punished. You were both being prepared. Prepared for a connection that wouldn't be built on fear, but on faith. Not on guessing games, but on communication. Not on attachment, but on intention. Not on trauma bonds, but on spiritual alignment. The separation wasn't the end of the story. It was the middle, the part where the characters evolve so the reunion has meaning, depth, and longevity. You had to learn how to love without losing yourself. They had to learn how to love without running from themselves. Read that again. And now that both of you have grown, in ways neither of you expected, in ways neither of you planned, in ways only God could orchestrate, the reunion approaching you isn't fragile. It has roots now. It has wisdom now. It has self-awareness now. It has emotional clarity now. It has spiritual grounding now. It has intention now. You aren't reconnecting as who you were. You're reconnecting as who you've become. That's why this reunion is different. That's why it's sacred. That's why it feels guided, not forced. That's why it brings peace, not confusion. This reunion isn't coming from desire. It's coming from divine timing. And that makes all the difference. Number 2. They finally faced the truth they spent years avoiding, and it completely broke them. There comes a moment in every person's life when the truth they've been running from finally catches up with them. And for your soulmate, that moment wasn't quiet. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't subtle. It hit them like a tidal wave. A wave of realization. A wave of regret. A wave of clarity. A wave of conviction. And the truth they finally faced is this. They never stopped loving you. They just didn't know how to handle what they felt. For a long time, they told themselves stories to avoid the depth of their emotions. They convinced themselves they were fine without you. They tried to numb the connection. They tried to distract themselves. They tried to rationalize their way out of anything that looked or felt vulnerable. But the heart doesn't forget what the soul recognizes. And no matter how far they tried to go, the truth kept following them. You were the one person they could never replace. And when that truth finally surfaced, when it finally demanded to be acknowledged, it broke something inside them. Not in a destructive way, but in a humbling, honest, soul-opening way. Because here is what they had to confront. They weren't ready back then. They weren't healed. They weren't mature. They weren't present. They weren't grounded. They weren't capable of giving you what you deserved. And even though they cared about you deeply, their own wounds were louder than their love. They were afraid of losing you, but even more afraid of being fully seen by you. They wanted closeness, but they were terrified of intimacy. They wanted to step toward you, But fear was dragging them backward. They wanted connection. But old trauma was still in control. They didn't walk away from you because you weren't enough. They walked away because they weren't prepared to be who you needed. And when that realization hit, it hurt. It humbled them. It stripped them. It softened them. It awakened them. For the first time they saw the pain they caused. Not because they were reckless, but because they were unhealed. And it broke their heart to acknowledge that losing you was never God's plan. It was the result of their fear, their immaturity, their hesitation. They once believed their silence protected them. But now they see that silence became the very thing that distanced them from the person they prayed for. They once believed time would make them forget. But time only made the truth sharper, clear, more undeniable. They once believed someone else could replace what they had with you. But every attempt at connection fell flat. Every conversation felt shallow. Every moment felt temporary. Nothing compared. Nothing touched the same part of their soul. Nothing carried the same weight. They tried to move on, but their spirit kept pulling them back to you. You were the unfinished sentence in their heart, the open chapter, the unanswered prayer, the unresolved feeling they could not outrun. And now they're standing in a place they avoided for years. The place where honesty finally becomes louder than fear. They're realizing that the love they tried to suppress is not only still alive, is stronger, clearer, and more intentional than ever. They're realizing that their avoidance didn't protect them. It only prolonged the inevitable truth. Their heart always belonged with you. They're realizing that the distance didn't erase anything. It only revealed everything. They're realizing that God didn't remove you from their life. He held you aside until they were ready to face themselves. And now they're facing the truth with open eyes. They mishandled something sacred. They underestimated something divine. They overlooked something irreplaceable. And instead of pretending they're unaffected, instead of hiding behind pride, instead of numbing the ache, they're feeling it fully. They're grieving who they were. They're grieving what they lost. They're grieving the time wasted. They're grieving the moments they could have chosen differently. But that grief is not the end. It's the beginning. Because it is only when someone finally faces the truth that they become capable of telling it. And what they're preparing to tell you is going to change everything. Number 3. They tried to live without you, but life kept pointing them back to you. There comes a moment in every person's life when God begins to highlight what truly matters. He removes distractions. He breaks illusions. He reveals what the heart has been trying to bury. And for your soulmate, that moment came in a way they never expected. Because they genuinely believed they could move on. They convinced themselves the connection would fade. They told themselves time would dilute the feelings. They tried to treat it like any other breakup, any other disconnect, any other chapter they could simply close. But this was never any other love. This was soul-recognized, spirit-confirmed, God-touched love. And the truth is, they tried to move on, but life kept pulling them back. Every time they tried to silence their emotions, something reminded them of you. A song, a scent, a memory, a dream, a phrase you used to say. Even the smallest things became signs they couldn't escape. Not because they were obsessed, not because they were weak, but because the connection wasn't finished. You don't just walk away from something divinely orchestrated. And deep down they knew that. At first they tried to shrug it off as nostalgia. Then they tried to label it longing. Then they tried to dismiss it as loneliness. But none of those words fit the truth. Because what they felt wasn't a craving for comfort. It was the recognition of something sacred. This wasn't the ache of emptiness. This was the ache of purpose. It was the ache of knowing that the person who saw them most clearly was no longer standing beside them. And the more they tried to ignore it, the louder it became. Life kept pointing them back to you. Not through obsession, but through revelation. Because every attempt to build something new failed to satisfy them. They found themselves comparing every person to you. Not intentionally. Not because they wanted to, but because the connection they shared with you set a standard their soul couldn't lower. You weren't just a chapter in their story. You were a turning point. And when God ordains a turning point, nothing else feels right until you return to it. There were nights they sat in silence, thinking they were finally healing, only to have a wave of emotion hit them so hard. It left them breathless. There were moments they felt strong and independent, only for a random memory to break them open, all over again. There were times they thought they were better off without you, and then life showed them exactly what better off really meant. Empty victories, surface-level connections, hollow distractions. They tried to fill the void with busyness, with people, with noise, with accomplishments, with anything that would drown out the truth screaming inside them. But nothing worked, because when God places a connection in your life for a divine reason, you cannot outrun it. You cannot bury it. You cannot replace it. You cannot rationalize it away. Your heart will always return to what your soul recognizes. And your soulmate had to learn that lesson the hard way. They had to learn that space doesn't dissolve real love. It intensifies it. They had to learn that silence doesn't erase a bond. It deepens it. They had to learn that distance doesn't weaken connection. It reveals the truth about it. Your absence didn't create emptiness in their life. It exposed it. And now they're finally facing what they tried to avoid. Life without you isn't life. It's survival. They're functioning. They're moving. They're working. They're doing what they're supposed to do. But they're not fulfilled. They're not alive. They're not grounded. Because the part of them that felt safe, that felt understood, that felt honored, that felt seen, that felt chosen, that part existed with you. And now they realize that the love they felt wasn't temporary. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't circumstantial. It was real. It was spiritual. It was purposeful. It was God-written. And the reason they couldn't let you go, the reason life kept circling them back, is because your story with them isn't finished, not even close. They're waking up to the truth that the love they tried to escape is the love they're destined to return to. And that realization is about to change everything. Number 4. Their family finally spoke the truth, and it shook them to their core. There comes a moment in every love story where the outside voices can no longer stay silent, where the people closest to someone, the ones who witnessed their patterns, their pain, their pride, their mistakes, finally speak up about the truth they've been watching unfold in silence. And for your soulmate, this was that moment. Because their family, the people they thought would support the narrative they had been telling themselves, did the opposite. They didn't tell them to move on. They didn't tell them to forget you. They didn't say, it wasn't meant to be. They didn't try to replace you with someone new. Instead, they told them the truth. The raw truth. The uncomfortable truth. The truth they never had the courage to admit. They were happier with you. More grounded with you. More at peace with you. More focused with you. More aligned with their purpose when you were in their life. And hearing that truth shook them loose from the illusions they had been clinging to. Because for the longest time, they convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. That pulling away from you was maturity. That distancing themselves was necessary. That detaching was responsible. That choosing silence was somehow strength. But their family called it what it really was. Fear. Avoidance. Insecurity. Emotional immaturity. A defense mechanism dressed up as reason. Someone they trust. Someone who knows their patterns better than anyone. Looked them in the eye and said, you were different when you had them in your life. Calmer. More alive. More focused. You loved deeper. You grew faster. You became a better version of yourself when you were with them. And hearing that cut deep. Not because it was cruel, but because it was real. Their family wasn't trying to push them toward you. They were trying to hold them accountable. Because the people closest to you see what you hide. They see the longing behind the sarcasm. They see the regret behind the excuses. They see the grief behind the tough exterior. They see the truth behind the denial. And they saw it in your soulmate. They saw how their eyes shifted when someone mentioned your name. They saw how their posture changed when a memory surfaced. They saw the softness in them that only existed when you were around. They saw the ache they tried to bury under distractions. They saw the weight of the decision they made. And for the first time, they said it out loud. You let go of the wrong person. And you know it. Those words hit your soulmate like a revelation. Because deep down they already knew. They had been avoiding the truth, but not escaping it. Scripture says, You will know the truth and the truth will set you free. But before it frees you, it confronts you. It convicts you. It humbles you. It breaks you open. And that's exactly what happened. Your soulmate didn't break because you hurt them. They broke because they realized they hurt themselves when they let you go. Their family didn't tell them your worth because they needed to hear it. They told them because their soulmate needed to hear it. And that truth has been echoing inside them ever since. Now, instead of defending their choices, they're questioning them. Instead of pretending they're fine, they're admitting they're not. Instead of running from their feelings, they're finally sitting with them. Instead of numbing the ache, they're acknowledging the source of it. Instead of telling themselves you'll fade, they're realizing you're unforgettable. Their family didn't convince them of anything. They simply confirmed what your soulmate already knew. Their life was better with you in it. Their spirit was stronger with you beside them. Their heart was softer when they loved you. Their future made more sense when you were part of it. And now they're wrestling with that truth. All the illusions have fallen. All the excuses have collapsed. All the pride has been challenged. All the denial has been exposed. They can't hide behind silence anymore. They can't pretend they don't care. They can't act like you were just another person. Because you weren't. You were the turning point. You were the shift. You were the blessing they didn't realize they were losing. Until someone finally told them the truth. And that truth is pushing them back toward you. Number 5. They realized you were the only one who loved them purely, and it broke them open. There is a kind of love that does not appear often in a person's life. A love that is steady, sincere, patient, rooted in truth and not agenda. A love that doesn't demand performance, perfection, or pretending. A love that doesn't punish vulnerability but welcomes it. A love that doesn't change with circumstances but deepens with understanding. And your soulmate is realizing, with a depth that's shaking them to the core, that you were the only person who loved them like that. Not for what they could give. Not for how they looked. Not for their status, potential, or achievements. Not for convenience. Not for ego. Not for validation. You loved them because your soul recognized theirs. You loved them in a way that saw beyond their flaws. You loved them in a way that honored their humanity. You loved them with patience, with grace, with compassion. You loved them even when they were inconsistent, unsure, or afraid. You loved them without trying to mold them into something else. And now that they've interacted with other people, now that they've tried to explore other connections, now that they've been exposed to what the world calls love, they're realizing just how rare and how sacred your love truly was. Because everyone else wanted something. Everyone else had conditions. Everyone else had expectations. Everyone else needed a version of them they couldn't sustain. And for the first time, they're seeing the difference between attention and connection, chemistry and compatibility, validation and love. They're realizing that the people who came after you didn't want their heart. They wanted their presence. They wanted the idea of them, the image of them, the comfort of them, but not the truth of them. You, on the other hand, loved their truth, even when they weren't ready to face it. Scripture says, perfect love drives out fear. Not because it's flawless, but because it's authentic. Real love doesn't expose someone's wounds to shame them. It exposes their wounds so healing can begin. And that's what your love did. Your love showed them a version of themselves that they had abandoned long ago. A softer version. A more open version. A more courageous version. A more honest version. You awakened a part of them they didn't think they were allowed to keep. But here's the heartbreaking part. They didn't know what to do with that love at the time. Your love felt too pure for someone who didn't believe they were worthy of it. Your presence felt too safe for someone who wasn't used to safety. Your acceptance felt too deep for someone who was still rejecting themselves. They didn't push you away because they didn't care. They pushed you away because they didn't feel deserving. But life has a way of revealing what we take for granted. And now, after experiencing the superficial, after encountering the inconsistent, after witnessing the conditional nature of other relationships, your soulmate sees clearly, the love you gave them was the rarest form of love they will ever experience. And here's the part that truly broke them. They didn't love you the way you loved them. Not because they didn't want to, Not because they didn't try, but because they weren't healed enough to offer the same depth. They weren't grounded enough to match your consistency. They weren't mature enough to hold what you offered. They weren't emotionally free enough to surrender to the connection. You loved them purely. They loved you fearfully. You loved them wholeheartedly. They loved you cautiously. You loved them openly. They loved you defensively. And now they finally understand the cost of that difference. They're waking up at night with the realization, I had something real, and I didn't choose it when it mattered. They're sitting in silence thinking, no one has ever loved me like that. They're replaying moments thinking, they loved me better than I loved myself. And as painful as this truth is for them, that pain is transforming them. It's humbling them. It's healing them. It's awakening them. It's maturing them. It's preparing them. Because knowing what real love feels like changes you. It changes what you seek. It changes what you accept. It changes what you offer. And it changes who you become. Your soulmate isn't just missing you. They're realizing you were the only person who loved them with purity, with depth, with truth. And that realization is pushing them towards something they didn't have before. The desire to love you back with the same depth that you loved them. Number 6. They're realizing God didn't remove you. He protected the connection until they grew. There comes a point in every journey where the pain finally starts making sense. Where the separation stops feeling like punishment and begins to look like protection. Where the distance reveals what closeness once blinded. Where the silence becomes a classroom instead of a wound. And your soulmate is standing in that exact moment right now. The moment where their entire perspective shifts. Because for the longest time, they believed you were removed from their life. They believed the connection ended. They believed they lost you. They believed the door closed. They believed God was saying no to what they felt. But now they're realizing something far deeper. Something far more spiritual. Something they never had the maturity to understand back then. God didn't remove you. He protected what the two of you had. Because your soulmate wasn't ready to handle it. And that truth is changing everything inside them. Because look at the pattern. They weren't stable enough to love consistently. They weren't grounded enough to communicate honestly. They weren't healed enough to be present emotionally. They weren't mature enough to choose you without fear. They weren't spiritually awakened enough to recognize what God placed in front of them. And if God had allowed the two of you to move forward in that state, it would have destroyed the connection, not fulfilled it. God doesn't build divine relationships on unstable foundations. So instead of letting immaturity ruin something sacred, He allowed distance, not to break the connection, but to protect it, not to punish, but to prune, not to end, but to prepare, not to separate, but to strengthen. Your soulmate is beginning to see that clearly now. They're starting to notice the timing. They're noticing the lessons. They're noticing the growth. They're noticing how much their heart has changed since you were gone. They're recognizing how blind they were back then, and how awake they are now. And the realization is hitting them hard. If God had let us stay together in that season, I would have sabotaged everything. They see it now. They see the unhealthy patterns they carried. They see the emotional immaturity they denied. They see the fear that ruled their decisions. They see how quick they were to run. How slow they were to communicate. How deeply they felt yet how tightly they hid those feelings behind walls. And in this moment of clarity, they're realizing God wasn't withholding you. He was protecting you. Protecting you from their inconsistency. Protecting you from their lack of readiness. Protecting you from their inner battles. Protecting you from the self-sabotage they hadn't healed yet. But here's the part that's truly shaking them. God was protecting them too. He was protecting their heart from breaking you. Protecting them from living with regret too early. Protecting them from losing you permanently through their own unhealed patterns. He put the connection on pause, so it wouldn't be destroyed beyond repair. Now your soulmate sees the truth. The waiting wasn't wasted. The distance wasn't random. The silence wasn't abandonment. The separation wasn't the end. It was divine alignment. Timing catching up with destiny. They're beginning to see how much they've grown since then. They're more self-aware, more grounded, more emotionally present, more spiritually connected, more intentional, more honest, more capable of giving and receiving love without shutting down. And for the first time in their life, they're grateful for the delay. Not because they wanted it, but because now they understand it. Scripture says, "To everything there is a season." And your soulmate is realizing that you were not the wrong person. The timing was the wrong season. They're seeing that God wasn't breaking the connection. He was maturing it. They're seeing that the separation didn't weaken the bond. It prepared the bond to survive the future. They're seeing that what they thought was rejection was actually divine protection. And here is the most powerful part. Now that they've grown, now that their eyes are open, now that their heart is humbled, now that their spirit is aligned, they're ready. Ready to communicate, ready to choose you, ready to love you the right way, ready to step into the connection God preserved, ready to honor what they once mishandled, ready to build what they were once afraid to start. They're realizing the connection didn't die. It was being protected until they became the version of themselves who could finally honor it. Number 7. They're preparing to come forward because silence is no longer an option. There is a moment in every journey where the heart can no longer stay quiet, where the emotions that were once buried rise to the surface with force, where truth becomes louder than pride, fear, or hesitation, where staying silent causes more pain than speaking the truth ever could. And your soulmate has reached that moment. For months, maybe years, they've been wrestling with the tension between what they feel and what they show. They've been carrying the weight of unspoken emotions. They've been living with questions they never answered. They've been replaying memories they thought they could outrun. They've been revisiting conversations that never happened. They've been living with the ache of incompletion. But something shifted inside them recently. Something spiritual, something emotional, something undeniable. The silence that once felt safe now feels suffocating. The distance that once felt necessary now feels unbearable. The excuses that once felt believable now feel hollow. They've tried to move on. They've tried to distract themselves. They've tried to convince themselves the connection would fade. They've tried to tell themselves you're better off without them. They've tried to choose logic over longing. But the heart doesn't negotiate with destiny. And God doesn't silence a connection He intends to restore. Now they're feeling the pull. A pull so strong they can no longer deny it. A pull that wakes them in the middle of the night. A pull that whispers to them throughout the day. A pull that keeps leading them back to you again and again. It's not obsession. It's alignment. It's not fantasy. It's clarity. It's not weakness. It's surrender. Because for the first time in a long time, they're admitting to themselves, I was wrong. I wasn't ready. I should have communicated. I should have chosen them. I should have loved them better. I can't lose them again. And these realizations are no longer just feelings. They're pushing your soulmate toward action. They're preparing to come forward. Not impulsively. Not carelessly. Not emotionally dumping. Not showing up half-healed. Not returning out of loneliness or confusion. But intentionally. Respectfully. Clearly. Honestly. Fully. They're preparing to come forward because the love they feel has matured. Because the connection has deepened through distance. Because the silence has spoken louder than words ever could. Because the separation taught them what closeness meant. Because life without you has revealed what life with you truly was. And here is the truth they're finally ready to face. They don't want to live the rest of their life wondering what could have been. They don't want regret to be their long-term companion. They don't want fear to be the reason they lose their blessing. They don't want pride to cost them their future. They don't want God to open the door again only for them to walk past it. They want to show up differently this time. They want to love with intention. They want to communicate with honesty. They want to choose you without hesitation. They want to build something real, stable, lasting, God-backed, spiritually aligned. And they know the first step isn't a grand confession. It's honesty. Honesty about how they feel. Honesty about what they've learned. Honesty about what they regret. Honesty about what they want now. They've rehearsed the words in their mind. They've imagined the moment. They've prayed for clarity. They've asked God for timing. They've battled fear after fear, doubt after doubt, memory after memory. But still the pull remains. Because the silence is now heavier than the truth. Because the distance is now more painful than the risk. Because the fear of losing you forever is now greater than the fear of being vulnerable. Scripture says, the truth will set you free. And your soulmate is finally ready to be free. Free of the what? Free of the regrets. Free of the silence. Free of the pride. Free of pretending they don't care. They're preparing themselves emotionally, spiritually, and mentally to come toward you with clarity and intention. They're preparing to speak. They're preparing to reveal. They're preparing to apologize. They're preparing to explain. They're preparing to open their heart in a way they've never done before. Because now they know. The connection didn't survive everything by accident. The emotions didn't return by coincidence. The timing didn't shift randomly. And the love didn't deepen without purpose. They're preparing to come forward. Because they finally understand. You are the person their soul refuses to let go of. You are the person God preserved for this moment. You are the person they're meant to speak their truth to. And nothing inside them will allow them to stay silent any longer. This is the moment where everything we've talked about comes full circle. Because after all the signs, after all the inner wrestling, after all the late nights they spent awake, after all the realizations that rose to the surface, after all the ways God has been pressing truth into their spirit, you now understand something deeply. This connection is not random. This love is not accidental. This journey is not meaningless. This timing is not coincidence. You've been walking through a season that felt confusing, a season where answers seemed hidden, a season where you questioned your worth, your value, your impact on someone's life. But now you can see the bigger picture. You weren't losing anything. You were being positioned. You weren't being forgotten. You were being refined. You weren't being left behind. You were being prepared. Because God cannot bring you into something sacred while your heart is still carrying the wounds of previous versions of yourself. And here's what I need you to hear right now, clearly, boldly, with authority. Your soulmate's awakening would not have happened if you weren't growing too, if you weren't healing, if you weren't elevating, if you weren't spiritually aligning, if you weren't stepping into the version of yourself who can actually sustain the blessing. This journey is not just about their realization. It's about yours. It's about recognizing that you are worthy of clarity, worthy of commitment, worthy of being chosen openly, worthy of being loved loudly and consistently, worthy of a relationship that mirrors what God intended. Not chaos, not confusion, not emotional breadcrumbs, but real covenant-level love. Now hear this. When they come forward, and they will, you won't meet them as the version of you who once waited, doubted, and questioned everything. You will meet them as the version of you who survived the silent seasons. The version of you who grew through the uncertainty. The version of you who refused to shrink. The version of you who refused to settle. The version of you who learned to love yourself with a different strength. Because that's the version they're meant to reunite with. That's the version God has been shaping. That's the version your soulmate's heart has been waking up to. And if you're still listening right now, if you're still here with me, that tells me something powerful about you. Your heart is open. Your spirit is listening. Your faith is alive. Your soul recognizes truth when it hears it. So before we close, let me speak this blessing over you. May you walk into this next chapter with grace. May you release every version of yourself that was built in survival. May you welcome the clarity that's on the way. May you trust God's timing without fear. May you receive the love that's been maturing behind the scenes. And may your heart stay soft enough to recognize the moment when everything shifts. Because it will shift. It is already shifting. The awakening has begun. The truth is moving toward you. The connection is preparing to come alive again. Not in the old form, but in a renewed, mature, God-aligned version that has the power to last. Now, before you go, if this message spoke to you deeply, if it resonated in your spirit, if you felt something align, release, or rise inside your chest, make sure you subscribe to this channel, Daily Motivation Prayers. Not just to support the content, but because this is your space. This is where you come to understand yourself, your relationships, and your spiritual path on a deeper level. This is where you come to be poured into, strengthened, and reminded of who you are. Drop a comment and tell me, what part hit you the most today? I do read them. Your words matter here. And if you feel led, if you want to sow into the work, you can also leave a super thanks. It means more than you know. But above all, hear me clearly. Your story is not over. Your love is not lost. Your connection is not finished. The truth is coming. The reunion is forming. And God is not done writing your chapter. I'll see you in the next video. Stay blessed. Stay open. Stay expectant. Amen.